This year, reports of an ice epidemic have gripped Australia. In response, the government has set up a special task force and funded a $9 million advertising campaign.
But despite our best efforts, the global war on drugs has been raging for exactly 100 years now, and there's no victory in sight. So maybe we're fighting the wrong battles. Well, according to British journalist Johann Hari, almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong.
Imagine all of you for 20 days now went off and used heroin 3 times a day. What would happen? Now, we have a story about what would happen that we've been told for a century. We think because there are chemical hooks in heroin, as you took it for a while, your body would become dependent on those hooks, you'd start to physically need them, and at the end of those 20 days, you'd all be heroin addicts, right? That's what I thought. What if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? For 100 years now, we've been singing war songs about addicts. I think all along we should have been singing love songs to them, because the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection.
And Johann Hari joins us now from London. Good morning to you, Johann. Thanks for being with us.
Hey Monique, hey Andrew, it's great to be with you both.
Now, we just heard you describe how people generally believe that addiction works. Why do you think that we are just so wrong?
It really surprised me. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was just a little kid then, so I didn't understand why. But as I got older, I realised we had quite serious drug addiction in my family. And when I realised we were coming up to the 100th anniversary of drugs being banned, I kind of realised there were loads of incredibly basic questions I didn't know the answer to, like what really causes addiction? And I decided to go on a journey across loads of countries, 30,000 miles, to sit with loads of people whose lives have been changed one way or another by this. And what I discovered really shocked me. If you had asked me 4 years ago what causes, say, heroin addiction, I would have said, well, what a stupid question. Heroin causes heroin addiction. And it was only really when I went and met an extraordinary professor called Bruce Alexander in Vancouver, who's really helped to change this story and to show what's really going on, that I began to understand it. He explained to me the idea of addiction we've all got in our heads about chemical hooks causing it comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Your viewers can do them at home today if they're feeling a little bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat almost always prefers the drugged water and almost always kills itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? It makes perfect sense with what we think. But in the 70s, Professor Alexander came along and looked at these experiments and he said, well, hang on a minute. We're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs.
Sure.
Let's do this differently. So he built a cage that he calls Rat Park, which is basically like heaven for rats, right? They've got everything a rat can possibly want. They've got cheese, they've got coloured balls. Crucially, they've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They hardly ever use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. And there are really important human examples I can tell you about. But what this leads us to think is that we've been thinking about addiction wrong. Human beings have an innate need to bond and connect. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're isolated or traumatized or beaten down by life, you will bond and connect with something that gives you some sense of relief.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, the drug is a replacement for other bonds which you really ought to have in your life. And so you say that is your thesis that most people who are actually addicted to drugs are lacking those other bonds, and therefore if we can replace those, then the addictions should in some way, sort themselves out?
We don't need to talk about this theoretically. I think you just summarised it brilliantly, but we don't need to talk about it theoretically. I'll give you 2 examples. In Vietnam, 20% of American troops were using huge amounts of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, people were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. There was a very detailed study that followed them home. What happened? They didn't go into withdrawal. They didn't go to rehab. 95% of them just stopped.
Yeah.
If you believe the old theory, that makes no sense. But if you understand this new theory, it makes perfect sense. If you're taken out of a hellish pestilential jungle where you don't want to be and you could die at any moment, and you go back to your nice life in Wichita, Kansas with your friends and your family, that's the equivalent of being taken out of that first cage and being put into the second cage, so you want to be present in your life. But in case this sounds a bit kind of airy-fairy and abstract, there was an entire country that acted on this, and I went there. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin,
Amazing.
which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year they tried the American way more. They arrested more people, they imprisoned more people, and every year the problem got worse. And one day the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition said, look, we can't go on like this. They set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve the problem. So they went away, they looked at all this evidence, all the evidence they could get, and they came back and they said, decriminalise all drugs, from cannabis to crystal meth.
Yes.
But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we used to spend on cutting addicts off, giving them criminal records, making them suffer, and spend it instead on turning their lives around. And it's interesting, that's not really what we think of as drug treatment in Australia and Britain. They did do a bit of rehab, they did do some of that, but the main thing they did was a huge program of job creation for addicts. Say you used to be a mechanic. They'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning and bonds. And when I went to Portugal, it was 15 years after that experiment had begun, and the results were in. Injecting drug use is down by 50%, 50%. Overdose is massively down, overall addiction is massively down, and one of the ways you know it works so well is even the people who led the opposition to the decriminalisation, who said things that a lot of your listeners are totally reasonably going to be thinking, but surely this is crazy, you'd lead to an explosion in drug use. Even the leaders of that campaign told me that it had worked incredibly well, the whole world followed. But the thing it most helped me with going to Portugal actually was to think about a much more personal thing, like a lot of people watching this who have addicts in their life that they love. You know, if I'm honest, it's very difficult, and I think one of the reasons why the debate about the war on drugs is so charged is because it runs through the hearts of each of us, right? We all have a bit of us that looks at addicts and thinks, I wish someone would just stop you. And it really helped me because the thing that we're taught to do in our culture with addicts, right, with addicts we love, is kind of typified by that show, Intervention, the reality show. You're meant to get the addicts, sit them down, everyone in their life, and say, if you don't shape up, we're going to cut you off, we're going to throw you out. And everything I'd learned from all this evidence suddenly made me think, oh, that's just the importing of the drug war logic that hasn't worked into our private lives.
So we need to do the opposite.
Exactly. So what I've tried to do with the addicts I love, and I can't tell you it's easy, I can't tell you I do it consistently, is to try to be Portuguese, which is to say, I love you whether you're using or whether you're not using. If you need me, I will come and sit with you and I will try to be with you, and you're not alone. And I think ultimately that approach is the best answer we've got to this very difficult question. And it has to inform how we act at every level, right? It's not just enough individuals on our own loving the addicts will help, but we need to have an approach based on love at this political and social level at the moment. The one thing you can say for the war on drugs is we've given it a fair shot. $1 trillion, 100 years, untold, hundreds of thousands of people have died, and we can't even keep drugs out of our prisons, right? The places that have tried the alternatives, where I have been and I have seen, and I write about in my book, Chasing the Scream, they are seeing incredible results. A policy based on love and compassion really works.
Johann, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. Fascinating insights. And if you want to learn more about Johann, he'll be speaking in Australia in early September. All of the details will be on our website.